Welcome back to A Case for Cannabis. My name is Alfredo Matthew. I'm the founder of Working World LLC, and we're so thrilled to have you here with us today. A Case for Cannabis is an educational series brought to you by the California Community Colleges with a focus on workforce, education, and career pathways. This is a series that is growing. We got to move something over there. This is a series that is growing. It's been 18 months in the making, and we're really happy with its launch. It's a combination of highly produced film podcasts and this live stream coming you straight out of Oakland Studio 405 Live. We're so thrilled to be here, and every 2 weeks we're going to have a new guest adding value to this conversation. The purpose of our series is to really shed a light on one of the fastest growing industries in the United States, the cannabis industry, an industry that has been with us since the beginning of time, but is really on the cusp of legalization, full legalization for the first time in its history. And we want to be a part of capturing this moment, helping to remove the stigma of cannabis and really thinking about how we have equitable access to this industry. Some of the folks that we'll be interviewing in the series are entrepreneurs, policymakers, scientists, health advocates. We're looking to really reach all kinds of people and get all kinds of stories, and you're going to meet one of those amazing people today. Today I'll be interviewing Javier Armas, the co-founder of BALCA and the author of Budtender Education. Javier is a native Oaklander. He's an incredible activist and entrepreneur, and we'll be learning all about his book, Budtender Education, today. Super excited to have Javier in the studio with us. But before we get to Javier, I want to highlight some of the interviews, the podcasts that you will see on our website, www.caseforcannabis.com. On the website, we've had interviews with Ms. Kika Keith, entrepreneur and activist, David M. Johnson, president of Merritt College, and soon Ms. Claudia Mercado, CEO of Cali Bueno. In order to get a sense of the quality of these videos, take a look at this trailer of Ms. Kika Keith.
I'm trying to inspire the people to understand the significance of being involved in this industry. Not just from the perspective of ownership, but from the perspective of the workforce that can be developed, as well as the community reinvestment that could happen from the tax dollars going back into the communities that have been ravaged by the war on drugs. The biggest barrier that people need to overcome is A, the stigma of cannabis, and then B, is proper preparation. I'm telling you, it starts with the education. And once we are educated and we understand how we need to operate in this compliant industry, then we have the opportunity to knock them other barriers down, the access to capital, the access to real estate. We have to demand that we want a part of this industry. And if in fact we take that position, the future is incredibly bright if we ensure that the money that is being made is invested in our community in taxes. But we got to demand it, and we have to create that future for us.
All right. So welcome back. As you can see, Kika Keith, super dynamic entrepreneur, activist. Go to the site to check out the full podcast interview with her. I think you'll find it amazing and inspiring. I know I did. But today I have with us the incredible Javier Armas, the author of Budtender Education. Javier, it's a super pleasure to have you with us today.
I'm very excited to be here. Pleasure's all mine. I love talking about cannabis, and I think your guys' public educational work around cannabis is very, very important. So I appreciate your guys' work and mission as well.
All right. Well, I mean, I love meeting authors. I love meeting folks who have a real social purpose, and it's clear from this book that you're a man with a mission. So, and I mentioned to you that I met you about 15 years ago at a party through Carlos Herrera in Oakland before I moved to the town, and I remember speaking to you because we were talking about labor history, and I was a history teacher in the Bronx at the time.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about your background, your roots. What brought you to the cannabis industry?
So I was born and raised in Oakland. Carlos Herrera and that family is friends with our family since we were 5 years old. We all played soccer together at Bushrod. Oakland has a very unique culture for social movements, civil rights, and cannabis. And when I was growing up, I was exploring these genres, these movements, and I definitely found a very serious importance towards these social movements, civil rights, connections with Latin America, struggles in Oakland. And I also found cannabis and the cultures around cannabis with Bob Marley and Cypress Hill. So I was very young, 12, 13, 14 years old. I remember Prop 215 getting passed, and I wrote graffiti and I wrote legalize nature. I was like a teenager, so I had this political, rebellious character about myself, and it was very much part of the Oakland landscape. I found myself part of that culture, adding to its movement, and also create that being a framework of shaping my identity that still drives me till today.
All right, so it's one thing growing up in Oakland and liking weed and being a part of the kind of political milieu. It's another thing to write a book.
For sure.
And I love that you actually wrote a book, and not just a book, you know, for an unknown audience. You wrote this book for a very specific audience.
Yep.
For budtenders, for
Yep.
folks who work in the industry.
Right.
Can you tell a little bit about what was your process writing this book, and who did you write this for?
It's a great question. So I've been doing cannabis retail education and sales work for almost 4 years now. When you do sales, the retailer wants an educational component. And I'm like, I have that down. So I would go into retail and not only do product educational work, I did cannabis education, historical and scientific work. So I'd bring a stack of books on cannabis, and I'd start summarizing each book to the budtenders, and they loved it.
What is a budtender?
A budtender is like a bartender, but instead of serving alcohol, you serve cannabis, and the word bud is a unit of a cannabis flower. So like one could smoke bud. So the first time the word was found used according to the USPTO office was 2007, so it's a newer word, but I think it just got into the dictionary.
Mm-hmm. But you wanted, so, right, budtenders, busy folks, they don't have a time to read 10 history books, so.
Budtenders are the key strategic human link between the industry and the millions of patients. And the problem is, if you're a nurse or a teacher, you go through a lot of training to be a nurse or a teacher. Right now, because the industry is so underdeveloped, there's zero training to be a budtender, or very little. And there's no standardized training across the board. And brands are using brand marketing to substitute education, which as someone that comes out of public education is not education.
So you're saying that everyone who has an issue, right? I can't sleep, I'm anxious, whatever my situation is, I go into cannabis retail and I talk to a budtender who probably has no formal preparation to help me with my medical condition. That's the current state of the industry, and your book is part of the movement to help professionalize the industry, prepare a more formal educational pathway so people can make more informed decisions.
Exactly, 100%. And the professionalization could go in many different directions. My book also integrates regenerative agricultural values, and it's written from an Oakland equity perspective. So I introduce key issues such as police brutality and Oakland equity funding into the book as necessary versus other educational institutions probably would see that as too political and want to separate it and just have a clean, more science-based presentation. I'm for cannabis science 100%, I'm just not going to separate it from political issues. So I'm creating a framework that unites the science and the social science into a common framework. I'm not the first to do this. The geography is very much a balance of that, and there's other disciplines that also balance that. I'm just applying that to a unique intellectual framework for modern day cannabis.
I love it. I love what you're doing. Part of the reason you are able to do something that is, I think, truly original is you're not coming from the academy. You're not writing this from an institutional lens. You're self-published. You're an autodidact. You're self-taught. And you're really writing a book. You told me you kept it concise because you want folks, regardless of education level, to be able to access this, but you're also not dumbing down the content. This is like you're taking the leading research and you're making it accessible to the people who need this leading research. And it is very timely, right? You're talking about George Floyd, you're talking about COVID, you're talking about the closures of cannabis retail stores all around the Bay Area, right? Why did you create this? Tell me a little bit about your process of writing it during the pandemic, and why did you make this so in the moment?
Great question. So when I was doing this educational work in the industry and I started writing a few articles, the budtenders would just take it out of my hand. It's so in demand, quality education. So my very first article, which was pre-pandemic, was unearthing a new business model, unearthing a new cannabis business model for California. And I wrote it on LinkedIn. LinkedIn gives you a category, an option to self-publish articles. So I did this kind of for fun, kind of as an experiment, kind of for me to be expressive of my writing and politics and all that. I wrote this article and the response was phenomenal. I mean, business owners, directors, organizational leaders read the article and wrote very thorough responses, which showed me they actually read the article, which is big because a lot of people, we don't have much of a reading culture right now. And so they encouraged me to continue that focused writing that's analytical, political, and grounded into the facts of the industry. So when COVID hit and I couldn't visit the retailers like I used to visit 8 to 10 retailers a day, I started cranking out cannabis articles every day. Every single day I would write a 5-page paragraph essay, and I wrote 35 articles, published them all, and I could see the algorithms on all these 35 articles, and I took the 22 articles that had the most favorable responses from our community, cleaned them up, re-edited them, reorganized them, wrote an intro, wrote an outro, and bam, I got the manuscript of my first book. I sent a lot of these articles to publishers, no one would touch it. So then I started learning, I just Googled how to self-publish a book, and it is the easiest time ever in human history. Humans have been writing books for 5,000 years. It has never been easier for a human being to self-publish a book. All you need is an international standard book number, a website that will house your publishing, and a few other little minor things. It's really not difficult. So the question is, what is the content of your book? Are people going to read it? Does it have that importance? And since I released my book December 4th, I've had over 1,000 books sold, and all these retailers I visit, a budtender will come out, be like, oh my God, you wrote that book, I read it. And I feel a really positive impact around here, Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, and the Bay Area. It's not outside the Bay Area, it's not LA, Humboldt, not yet, right.
But it's coming. I mean, we could talk about publishing because I think that's fascinating. I think your entrepreneurial mindset is fascinating, how you made a pivot, right, due to COVID and not being able to visit the retailers, and you started writing, right, which is you're adding tremendous value. You're a thought leader now in this space, and you're doing something original. But I want to get to some of the content in this book.
Yeah.
The first thing that struck me, right, because I'm a novice to this industry, right? I'm coming to this series not as an expert. I'm looking to meet experts like you. One of the things that's clear to me is that you have a reverence for this plant. the cannabis plant.
Right.
What do people need to know and understand about cannabis and humans' relationship with this plant?
Currently in California, we only test for 6 cannabinoids, which is the basic property of the cannabis flower that gives us medicine, right? There's 6 cannabinoids: THC, CBD, THCA, CBDA, CBG, and CBN, okay? There's 144 cannabinoids, which means there's 138 we don't test for, and the scientific knowledge we have of the 138 is very little to zero. And the amount of knowledge we have on these 6 cannabinoids is decent, but it's always growing. The leading cannabis chemist, Dr. Mushalem in Israel, discovered the THC cannabinoid in 1964. A Harvard scientist discovered the CBD cannabinoid about 6 years beforehand, but he didn't follow through on this whole lifelong mission like Mushalem. So Mushalem's considered the godfather of cannabis. In 1988, he discovered the endocannabinoid system, our biological system that has a perfect administration for cannabinoids from the cannabis, a system where we can intake these medicinal properties perfectly, way better than alcohol and all these other things that we regularly put in our system. And we have this cannabinoid, we have these cannabinoids that we're studying that we know very little about or something. And then we have the terpenes. And the terpenes is what gives us taste and flavor, and these also have medicinal properties. And the cannabis industry went through this phase where they wanted light extracts, so they went through CRC, color remediation, and it extracted a lot of important cannabinoids out, and it created a very white-looking extract that looked pretty on Instagram and looked pretty in retail. And after people consuming this for 6 to 12 months are like, this is incomplete, this is truncated, and there's a movement back to a more full spectrum. That's where you get your real medicinal properties. So the terpenes have these combinations that can do all types of incredible, have all these type of medicinal properties, and the way we combine them has incredible potentials in the sense that one Israeli pharmacologist took CBD, one cannabinoid, and they applied 3 terpenes with it, and they claim this can drastically reduce the coronavirus, right? This hasn't been proved, it's just one scientific study, but this is feeding off another scientific study done in Canada.
All right. So I'm going to synthesize this because I know that you can geek out and we can talk about terpenes and cannabinoids and right. But my layman mind is saying this is a plant that has been around from the beginning of humanity, civilization. We've grown up with this plant. And we have not really explored it because the plant has been criminalized. You're not really allowed to do scientific studies. The science has been repressed. So you're saying that there are even more medicinal properties, if we look at the full spectrum of this plant, that we're going to discover with legalization.
Yeah, I think we only discovered like 1 to 2%. We know very little about the whole science of the plant.
Talk to me a little bit about the impact of criminalization on cannabis and on, Oakland. Right?
So cannabis was not criminalized up until 1912 to 1915 in California. It was ignored until the Mexican Revolution, until all these immigrants started coming over, the Mexicanos, the Armenians, Turks, Indians, and they were using marijuana, hashish, different forms of cannabis. And because it was a radical immigrant, not your white American standard Western history, it really freaked out the political system, and they called cannabis loco weed, and the Mexicans are going to rape women, and all these crazy articles that they're putting out in that era. And that was the starting of a deep prohibition criminalization, and it was really focused on the Mexicanos, right? Really response to the Mexican Revolution. Pancho Villa's army in Chihuahua openly celebrated cannabis. That was on the border. That population definitely came over after the Mexican Revolution in 1910. We absorbed around 1 million immigrants, which was more than 1848. 1848 was 100,000 Mexican nationals that got pushed over because of the war. So 1910, that really was an explosion. That created California Prohibition. And from that, we've had a deep racist criminalization system against cannabis that we're starting to see open up. In 1937, Asselinger pushed this on the federal level and on the international level. And so you had very clear international prohibition of cannabis that modeled opium, international standards pressured from the US. Mexico, interestingly enough, because of Isaac Campos' book, Homegrown, he really focuses on how Mexico criminalized cannabis in 1920. And this has to do with the Mexican Revolution, crystallizing a certain constitution hostile to...
So like in my mind, I had no idea cannabis was tied in to the radical, backlash against immigrants in the 1920s and other things, right? I didn't realize that it went back that far. I'm just thinking, hey, the 1980s, the war on drugs. But you're saying that this war has been over 100 years, and it's really been a war against immigrants. It's a war against the other, right, in the American psyche. But it has had real impacts, economic impacts, right? 40,000 people or more have been imprisoned due to cannabis. Some folks are still in prison because of cannabis, even as it's being legalized. Folks who were formerly incarcerated can't necessarily enter into the industry. I read that in the MORE Act, right, that was recently passed by the US Congress, folks can't necessarily work in the industry that they had worked when they worked in the informal economy. So there's still a lot that needs to be done in this space. On the scientific side, how has it impacted our ability to get the most out of this plant?
Yeah, so the more recent prohibitions definitely created a whole culture of criminalization where if you're Black, Latino on the streets and you have like some weed on you, that creates a pretext to be criminalized. And I've seen this over and over again. And if you run that same scenario with the middle class white person in Piedmont, it's just not the case. When I was a high school teacher in Oakland and all these East Oakland kids had weed, my main focus to them is they're creating conditions for them to criminalize themselves because of that legal system. And that gets applied arbitrary, right? The cops are not going to go to the Berkeley Hills because they get a call about weed smoking.
Yeah.
But if there's guys on the Black, Latino hood corner smoking weed, making certain people feel uncomfortable, that becomes a pretext for that criminalization. So that is something that we just grew up with. We're raised in our teenage, that decriminalization, the culture of secrecy, that is really woven in, and that leads to the science. I mean, most scientists wouldn't touch cannabis. All the scientists that focus on cannabis from the 80s, 90s, 2000 were rebellious. Now we have science departments that are trying to get Prop 64 money. UC Davis just got $5 million. Other universities are going to get research money, so they'll do their thing. But they weren't doing research when you can get thrown in jail for it. They're doing research when they
very risk averse. But there has been a sea change, right?
Oh, for sure.
Medical marijuana started 1996 up until 2018. Then all of a sudden, recreational cannabis became legal. Can you tell us a little bit about that shift from the medical marijuana days to the recreational days to now potentially full legalization?
Yeah, my first job after undergrad was a bud tender in Hayward in 06, 07, 08 period, and we would go straight to Humboldt and get top grade flower from living soil, package it ourselves, pay city tax, and deliver it straight to the patient. And we didn't have a bunch of processed packages. We had eighths, quarters, halves, just flower. Now you walk into a dispensary and you have all types of categories of edibles and drinks and concentrates and so on. So at this point of juncture, the SB 420 was very cancer patient oriented. So a lot of the patients would come and they would smoke flower, right? I would always ask, why do cancer patients smoke flower? And I got really interesting responses from that one question. And it had a kind of a street medical line. There's a lot of street characters that came in, but they knew the medical value, and they're very respectful, and there's never any violence. So it's just a really interesting period, low level of regulation, still secretive, lack of paperwork, but very, very focused on the cannabis patient. SB 420 was written to empower the cancer patient that really needed.
Is that why people celebrate 420?
No, the 420 comes from something in the 60s or 70s, and this group of characters like started.
All right, I'm pulling you up.
It's all good. So long story short, the prohibition of cannabis has really criminalized our communities and super underdeveloped the science of cannabis. So now we're going to see a cultural, intellectual renaissance. I mean, every institution's jumping towards this, which is fine. But we want to make sure this transformation is equitable, responding to the historical damages, and really positions cannabis for its true medical character. And we haven't seen that yet.
All right. So that brings me to another point, right? This idea of BALCA. Maybe I'll show you over here, because you're also the co-founder of BALCA with Daniel, is it Molina? Montero, with Daniel Montero. And tell us about this movement, because part of this movement is you're trying to do political advocacy. It's not just going to be done by writing books. You actually have to organize and move people. So what is that about?
Very glad you asked that, because BALCA is doing phenomenal in the Bay Area. It's the Bay Area Latino Cannabis Alliance. And we've seen so many Latino professionals get treated like second-class citizens, laid off, discriminated against. We don't see a strong Latino equity movement, but yet the Latino community has deep roots into cannabis marijuana. So when we started to go to some of these equity events, we started to meet each other. I didn't know Daniel Montero. I met him at an equity event in San Francisco. And the more we all met, we started putting potlucks together. And then finally, we're like, we need to build a real organization that can speak for Latinos in cannabis, as far as professionals, business owners, and bud tenders, new entries, because it doesn't exist. And we want to be able to have a platform to speak about cannabis the way we want to speak about it to our communities in Spanish, the cultural framework, not be handcuffed by our employers. So when we launched this, including the very first bilingual cannabis newsletter, we have been met with nothing but positivity and volunteer recruits, people joining saying, how can I help? I want to get involved. This is what I do. As of now, we have approximately 14 BALCA volunteer leaders, 3 emerging chapters, Oakland, San Francisco, San Jose, with Sacramento also having some movement. We have some great people in LA, Riverside, that are supporting us. We're connected to Carlos Santana's organization. We're connected to Cheech Marin's organization. So we're really building inclusivity. We're also reaching out to our African American allies, our Asian allies, and we're sending very clear messages that we want to build with the Latino and the Black community. We want to empower the Asians. We have a friend who's a director in the National Cannabis Industry Association connected to the San Francisco Asian community, and he's really interested in building around Asian cannabis community principles parallel to BALCA. So we already feel our movement growing. Every month we have a mixer. We just had a fundraiser in the Fruitville. We have our next fundraiser in San Jose, July 24th, and we're gonna have our San Francisco fundraiser shortly after September 16th, Independencia de Mexico. So we have a very overt Latin American, Latino orientation to make our community feel empowered, professional, help their business, fight for civil rights, push education, and push culture. Those are our 5 points of our program, and we've seen nothing but a lot of love.
I mean, I love the design. I love that it's bilingual, right? It's in Spanish and it's in English. It's accessible. You know, no one is really printing anymore. So you're actually like printing these, dropping them off at retail stores, right? Everyone can read this online, but there's actual like printed copies, and you're creating social events and bringing folks together. For those of us that don't understand the equity community in cannabis, what does it mean? What does equity cannabis mean? And I understand that it's up to cities to institute their own local equity programs. California is the only state in the country that has actual equity programs. Give us a little bit of an understanding of who are these equity programs, like how do you become a part of it,
Right.
and how well are they doing? Like, is equity cannabis in Oakland doing well, or you know, is there a lot of room for growth?
There's a lot of confusion around equity because you have the business term equity owner, and then you have the political cannabis term equity, and they mean two totally different things, so it gets mixed up. So in the cannabis political world, equity means if you're an official equity business, that means the city that you're in officially designated you as an equity business based off their legal standard, which is somehow connected to being a victim on the war on drugs and or living in an area that's been a victim of a war on drugs for 5-10 years. I'm an official Oakland equity business operator through Javier's Organics. And Oakland launched the first equity program. I don't think it's doing very well. I think that's pretty knowledgeable here in Oakland. I think most Oakland equity businesses are not operational. It costs $5,000 to renew your license. So when that bill comes forth, I think a lot of people will go MIA and they lose their license. And we do have a handful of licenses that are doing really good. They also got a lot of funding from the state. So I don't think that's a foundation for success unless if you have money for everyone, which we don't. So I think the Oakland equity community's struggling. I think San Francisco's way more organized. I think Sacramento has a little something. LA's a total mess. Long Beach is all right. And then you got counties doing research. Humboldt County has a research on equity, but they haven't issued equity licenses, except our friend Timo got one, but no one else. You know, so.
I've heard the equity market is about 3% of the total market.
Okay.
Right? So that means the majority of brands, the majority of cannabis out there at all of these retailers is not coming from equity owners such as yourself, right? You shared like you're doing the education path because you don't have the capital to compete and to build a business in the actual product path. What are you seeing happening, right? So since 2018, since recreational cannabis got legalized, I'm sure it's attracted a lot more folks to the game.
Right.
And are you seeing that folks actually have access to the cannabis industry, or is it very highly, like you need a lot of capital to get in, there's a lot of hoops to jump through, and what we're gonna see is this industry being dominated by larger corporations? Is there a place for the small craft manufacturer that might care about that full spectrum flower that you were talking about at the beginning?
So that question you just asked is like the political battle. So many people are worried about the corporatization of cannabis in California because it is so capital intensive, so hyper regulated, and the taxes are through the roof very high. And it's very hard to build a business to go through that. But if you have a corporation with $100 million, you can get through it. So you're right that this is a very serious dynamic at play. And equity businesses are having to take in corporate capital to survive and play the game. So then there becomes a question of who has power, what values do you institute in this equity company that now has this capital from this other entity. It gets very political, it gets very tricky. And it's a very difficult terrain. We have not seen a clear route of success for the equity community. That is for sure. So our big response to this problem is BALCA leadership is meeting with the Humboldt County Growers Association, Origin Councils of Humboldt County, and other key legacy growers in Humboldt County who grow some of the best cannabis in the world. And we're linking them up. We're partnering up with equity operators here in the Bay Area. So we have a clean agricultural distribution, retail delivery system, independent pipelines that can serve the patient. We haven't accomplished this yet. We're engineering it. We're developing the blueprint. And with our newsletter, we're getting articles from equity operators that are local and humble legacy farmers, so we could really see both of their visions and create a foundation for that unification.
That is also something that I got out of your book that I really appreciated.
Yeah.
The recognition that the farmer is often invisible.
Right.
We don't know who grows our coffee.
Right.
We don't know who grows the tobacco,
Right.
who grows the cotton,
Right.
The field laborers, the farmers, that's an invisible part, right? We're horribly disconnected from our food, right? Cannabis is just another commodity, another food source, but you're saying that we have an opportunity in this industry to connect really that farm to table, the cannabis grower to the equity owner, so we can have a healthier, more holistically safe, and a product that does good by people and the planet.
100%. I have all these farmers hit me up who want me to sell their weed, and I don't have a position to do that yet, but I do want to create a community that can create that pipeline for that specific goal. And they're tired of getting ripped off. They get pushed around and treated like second-class citizens by distro companies and told to front a bunch of work. And
so you have a competitive advantage here, right? You have a market that you're going to be able to do. I'd say in addition to just education for bud tenders, you and other entrepreneurs need to get serious about your education in running and building businesses.
Yeah.
Right? That's my other platform that I'm always on. It's business education, entrepreneurship education.
Right.
Not being afraid of corporate structures, but understanding corporate structures,
Right.
how you leverage them to
Right.
build your business,
Right.
building relationships in the capital markets so that you can figure out how to access that capital.
Right.
All of that is super important because you just can't give up 97% of the market to folks who are coming in from the outside.
Right.
There's enough legacy people, and right now 2/3 or more of the market is still underground.
Right.
How is that underground market going to get above ground and formalized? That's the important transition.
For sure.
And it really is 2021 to 2025, this 4 or 5 year period. How are we going to help folks move from the informal market to the formal market? That's going to determine the future of this industry.
And not only that, that illicit market is 95% Black and Latino. You go to these illicit markets, it is heavily people of color who are very working class, can't buy $80 eights. They're in a market buying $15 eights. There's loud rap music. They have their own security systems. There's interesting subcultural worlds that we need to address, and the number one way, or the two ways we could address it is lowering the cannabis taxes and zero criminalization for this community to enter the legal world, which we want to do because we don't want to continue to criminalize their activity. The BCC and the state are going to gear up towards that.
Yeah.
They're giving warnings. They're like, okay, you got to get all licensed, but if you don't have money and the taxes are super high, it's not that easy to get licensed.
So you just said like two very important things: zero criminalization,
Right.
and what was the first piece?
Lowering
the
cannabis
tax
taxes.
rate, right?
Yeah.
You can't like overtax and kill a nascent industry. And I say the third prong, and that's what this series is about: how do we create formal education pathways so folks can get the knowledge that they need, right? With ESO Ventures, we talk about confidence, competence, and capital.
Right.
That's what every entrepreneur needs. The confidence that, hey, I can do this.
Right.
Look at other people. Let me get some accountability with my peers. Competence, let me get that just-in-time education. I don't want to go back to school for 4 years,
Right.
but I will take a class if it will help me build my business. and that seed capital
Right.
that helps me cover the cost to get that license, to get that facility rented, right? To build out a distribution channel.
Exactly.
We need to build this infrastructure, and right
Right.
now this infrastructure is not built.
Right.
Right.
And there's a lot of programs that want to do what you just said, and you'll join them, and they're not there yet. It's just a little too low level. The very basics. Let's go through a difference between LLC and S corp. It's like, all right, dude, I can get that from you too. So we need something more nuanced, more cannabis oriented, and we can't be scared of the numbers. We got to look at cultivation taxes, excise tax, sales tax, and come up with a mathematical system. And when I tell this to people, they're like, aren't you just going to cheat the system like everyone else? I was like, no! And a lot of these big corporations are just cheating the system. And that's
We're cheating with the amount of taxes, but I'm thinking about how much tax revenue the state of California is losing right now because it has not created an easy way for people to move from the informal to the formal economy.
Right.
If we actually reduce the barriers to entry
Right.
to formalize, our tax revenue would actually grow
For sure.
tremendously.
For sure. But then the state has to deal with these subcultures, which is not ready to do, so that's where it kind of stays away, but it totally should. You're 100% right.
All right.
And there's a racial component. Like if you go to expensive cannabis retail, it's majority white, and you go to these illicit markets, it's majority POC. It doesn't take a sociologist to figure that out.
All right. So we're getting to some really root inequities, racial justice issues, all of this stuff.
Right.
What is the call to action, right? I want everyone, check out Budtender Education, check out BALCA.
Right.
What is the call to action? How can people get involved if they want to get involved in this movement or they want to participate?
You got to be involved in your city politics. That's where you have a voice. I have a voice in Oakland. If you're grounded in your city, you can go to your own city hall, talk to city council people, and have impact. And if we had small groups of people all throughout California, we could really have a statewide movement. It shouldn't just be the activist centers like Oakland and San Francisco that are known for protests. Any individual can mobilize their friends and push local government towards a certain direction. Now that gets reduced when you go to the county, and it really gets reduced to the state, and it almost disappears on a federal level. That's why local organizing is impactful. And if we create multiple communities that are organizing multiple localities, then you could see the compound impact. And that's the BALCA strategy. We're building Oakland, San Jose, San Francisco. We're looking at the Oakland Cannabis Commissioner that has 3 vacant positions. Mm-hmm. We're discussing internally in BALCA, does anyone want to move into the Cannabis Commissioner position and be a formal political leader for Oakland Cannabis? And if we could do that in Oakland, and if we do something parallel in other cities, it all will build on each other. The newsletter helps it wrap for clear communication. And there's a lot of very serious social movement organizers in California that have yet to enter cannabis.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely like, come on over, let's build a movement. There was a protest in Sacramento last week or something like that. It was just a startup. It wasn't tons of people. It was kind of more the leaders. I would like to see that turn into more of a mass movement with mass participation, and that's when we can see real change.
A mass movement with mass participation. One of the challenges is definitely this stigma, right? I'm doing this series, The Case for Cannabis. I'm not that familiar with the cannabis industry. This is not my forte. And I know some people who see me posting on LinkedIn, oh, join this live stream, Case for Cannabis. They're like, what is Alfredo doing? He's an educator. He believes in workforce. He does this stuff. Why is he doing this? I think that this is a tremendous opportunity to get for redemption, to get it right. We've messed up so many other industries. We have a chance to do something and get it right. I think BALCA is part of it. I think your writing is part of it. I'm excited for what you're going to do with your writing, right? All the other stuff that you're doing, if you focus on your writing and you take this seriously and you formalize it, I think it's important, right? There's not a lot of people in this lane. What is the future of you with your writing? What is coming next?
I try to work on every moment I can. Budtender Education, Volume 2, A People's History of Medical Cannabis from the very beginning, 53 million years ago, to the present, synthesizing every cannabis history that's been written in English, or in Spanish. And I have a 90-page manuscript. I'm really working on my Mexico article. The Mexico history is super interesting. Harold Isaacs wrote a book, Isaac Campos wrote a book called Homegrown. That's really good. But yeah, the Latin American history, I'm really interested. There's a great book about how enslaved Africans were taken by the Portuguese to Brazil, and they smuggled cannabis seeds with them and were building gardens in the 1640s. And there's enough ecological and linguistic evidence to prove that this was really the case, but it wasn't given credit because of our prejudices towards African contributions.
Maconha.
Yeah.
No Portuguese, se fala maconha.
Right.
Maconha, was that in the Colombos that they were doing this?
That was the Portuguese. But that word is African rooted, used in Brazil and Colombia. So Brazil and Colombia and Jamaica have Afro-centered cannabis words.
Okay.
And this author even argues that marijuana, which supposedly comes from Maria y Juana, comes from an African word, marijuana. And he has this whole argument of why that's the case. He hasn't proved it, or it hasn't been proven, but that's his argument. That's Cristobal's argument.
So it's clear to me there is a lot of research that has been done, that is going to be done, and this is a burgeoning industry. And you know, because you're a historian, whoever writes the history kind of determines the future, right? You're getting to tell the story, so you want to kind of uncover this untaught history.
Right.
It's never been taught formally in the schools. It's not taught in medical school.
Right.
Right? Doctors don't know any of the history of cannabis. So as cannabis gets legalized, there is going to be a renaissance of research, history writing, all of this stuff. This is a very exciting time to be in this history. Just leave us with a final word, like, what are you most excited about in 2021, 2022?
Cannabis has the most unlocked medical and cultural potential for positive change that human society has ever been able to access, and it is our responsibility to make sure that happens in the best way possible.
So exciting. Javier, it's been incredible speaking with you today. We're going to take a moment. We're going to watch someone who I know who I know that you know, Miss Claudia Mercado. We have a little trailer of our interview with her. We're going to watch that trailer, and then I'm going to come back, and I'm just going to close it out with 3 lessons that I learned with the amazing Javier Armas. Thank you so much.
My goal is really to scale Cali Bueno to a point where we're profitable, and to also create a company that Latinos and people of color feel proud about, that they see themselves represented, and that they also know that Cali Bueno has their best interest. Definitely building a long-term relationship with our consumers is something that we really care about. We need to have an industry that is going to have diversity, and that's going to have people that are value aligned, looking after our community. People are going to start to fall in love with cannabis, and that's going to create demand, and it's going to create a lot of opportunities. So people need to get excited about the opportunity and also the outcome. The outcome for me is bringing good product to market where people who have been put in jail or imprisoned for being in this industry can now be part of this industry legally and actually create generational wealth. And in the process, enjoy some good weed.
So thank you for tuning in and joining A Case for Cannabis today. This has been an incredible conversation with Javier Armas. My 3 takeaways from today's conversation. 1, the time is now. There's never been a better time to get involved in this industry. It's at an inflection point. Anyone who wants can play a role in shaping its future. 2, you can be self-taught, but we need formal pathways. Not everyone is going to be as entrepreneurial as Javier to go out and collect all that research and synthesize it. We need to develop formal pathways so that bud tenders and others can get the preparation they need to serve the public well. And 3, the medical possibilities with this plant. I want to explore that in future episodes. I don't understand the science. I want to better understand the science, because if we're only really using 6 of 144 potential properties that this plant has, what other benefits might it have for society? And as we have full legalization, how is this going to transform our health, education, food, all of the different industries and pathways that we have? Very exciting time. Coming up next, we have another live stream in 2 weeks. Really excited. We're going to be having a conversation with some of our ESO entrepreneurs, Eastside Oakland entrepreneurs that have cannabis-based businesses. Really hope we're going to hear from Robert Gilchrist, Let's Grow Inside, Chris Wakefield, Brown Sugar Botanicals, Jazmín and Enrique from Cocina del Corazón, and our very own Eric Moreno in the studio today, Studio 405 Live. They're all building, and I can't forget Ronnie West, the 6th man, and SF Canna, right? All of them bringing their unique entrepreneurial stories, making their way in this industry. We also have upcoming episodes. Claudia Mercado, her interview, her podcast interview and trailer are now live on the Case for Cannabis website. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to have David Ume, High Speed CEO of High Speed, and we're going to close the series with Rashad Johnson, Government Affairs for Ease. It is an exciting time. Over this next year, we're going to have 40 episodes, 20 podcasts, 20 live streams. We really appreciate you tuning in today. We'll be back every 2 weeks. We love being here, really excited.